A fire on the shore at midnight. The revitalizing power of a ritual fire on the summer solstice in Ecology. A contemporary reawakening, in a sense, of the Johnsmas fires that renewed Orkney life, human and non-human, up to the mid-19th century. People are drawn from all over the country to experience such magic and escape from their own routines. And yet, of course, Orkney's shores are not spaces outside of modernity. I live on the island of Rousey in Orkney, and when I come to the shore, I'm in the presence of plastic. I'm in the presence of concrete, markers of the Anthropocene. And I thought I'd take advantage of the fact that this is a recorded talk to talk and think in situ and take Orkney as a vantage point to reflect on shifting relationships between humans and the environment and the nature of those relationships. As enchanted or disenchanted, what sense does it make to speak of magic in the Anthropocene? So I'm here in front of a remnant of the hill dike, sometimes known as Feely Dyke, Feely coming from the old Scots for turf, because that was what it was built up out of. And this is the snaking boundary between the farmsteads of the cultivated lowland and the moorland commons behind. And this boundary is significant in marking the transition between infield and outfield, a transition that's been widely theorised in the context of Norse geography and cosmology. Now, that's significant for us given that Orkney was a Norse territory prior to its absorption by Scotland in the late 15th century, and that there's a sense that remains of distinctive Nordic identity, often activated and reinvigorated by contemporary political issues. So it's worth paying attention to these kinds of cosmological distinctions. And for example, Kirsten Hastrup, in her anthropological work on medieval Iceland, theorises this infield-outfield distinction as being one in which people moved between the infield of the farmstead, domesticated, humanised, familiar, into the outfield, which was untamed, wild, at the limits of knowledge, and a place of non-human forces. Now, we have to be careful about overstating this binary. People did, of course, move into and through the outfield. It was a site of resources. For example, here in Orkney, people would have cut peat in the moorland commons. The turf to build up the dike itself is coming from that outfield. And of course, we have to be careful about the blind transposition of this to Orkney. It's been very carefully done, for example, by the archaeologist Dan Lee of the University of Highlands and Islands, who's reflected on this infield-outfield transition very ably and far better than I can do, thinking about Rousey and thinking about how people negotiated and renegotiated these boundaries. But the reason why I've come here and want to talk about this is because I think it's symbolically important for thinking about Anthropocene magic and thinking about the impact that anthropogenic landscapes have on thinking about human and non-human cosmologies. So when we're thinking about this as the remnant of the hill dike, what we have to think about is the expansion of the infield, the expansion of this domesticated, homely landscape. First, in the literal sense of the reconstruction of hill dikes of this type, the reconstruction of feely dikes to encompass more of what had previously been outfield. And as I've said, the archaeologist Dan Lee has provided a detailed account of this process in the 16th and 17th century, and the way that on the west side of Rousey, the reconstruction of hill dikes incorporating more of the outfield would have renegotiated the relationship with the otherworldly character of ancient burial mounds. But also when we're thinking about this expansion of the infield, we're also thinking about it in the more general sense of the reclamation of greater and greater tracts of hill land. What the anthropologist Jo Lever-Gunst describes in his fieldwork in Orkney as what he was told as taking bits out of the hill. So you're taking bits from hill land and adding it to the cultivated land, expanding grassland for silage and pasture, making what had been moorland productive for modern livestock-led farming. And so the reason I've come here to the Feely Dyke is thinking about this as a remnant of a transition which is now in many senses past, because this infield, the domesticated land, has expanded to encompass more and more of the outfield. And this is an ecological change, first of all. It's a change that represents the massive loss of peatlands. And when we think about the loss of peatlands to grazing, to grassland in Orkney, we have to think about that in global context, because that's part of a major global anthropogenic change in Earth systems, as what had once been an enormous carbon sink of the global peatlands becomes more and more of a carbon source as the peatlands are drained and oxidized. But it's also a point where we can think about social change. This expansion of the domesticated, cultivated landscape is an improvement which results, in the context of Rousey, in displacement. Rousey is the only island in Orkney that was subject to the large-scale clearances that transformed the geography of Highland Scotland, where tenant farmers were made way for the expansion of large estates. And this is a process which began in Rousey in 1841, when the land was purchased by George William Trail, who set about clearing inhabitants from his estate, and then was continued in the form of rack renting by Frederick Burrows, his nephew, following Trail's sudden death in 1847. And so this is a change which affected people's relationship with, sense of place in the landscape. Can we also think about it as a cosmological change? A change in sense of place, surely, but also a change in the relationship with the landscape and with the non-human forces that lay within, as more and more of the landscape becomes subject to improvement, becomes subject to management that is for the sake of humans, yes, for the sake of making this into productive farming land, but also in that process is displacing humans and changing the lived relationships with the land. What's happening to the cosmology as Infield expands and encompasses more and more of the outfield? Now, these kinds of social and cosmological shifts are never without tension, and I've come here to Taverso Tuig, what we now understand to be a Neolithic tomb, a chambered cairn, to give an episode which I think illustrates some of these tensions. Taverso Tuig was on the grounds of Trumland House, which was built in 1875 for the landowner Frederick William Trail Burrows and his wife Lady Eliza Trail Burrows, on their return from India, where Trail Burrows had been serving in the army. And he was and remains a controversial figure locally. He saw himself as an improver of the land, someone bringing development to the island, a pier, a road, the improvement of the schools, and so on. Locally, he's quite often remembered as somebody who raised rents beyond that which could be paid, who evicted families and pursued those who opposed him vindictively. So, given that his is a contested history and his landscape is a contested landscape, what can we tell from this encounter with an ancient monument, with this Neolithic tomb? And I want to pick up the story from the journal of Lady Eliza Trail Burrows on the discovery of this cairn in 1898. She had sent the workmen out to dig into a mound on her grounds to build a summer seat so that one could take tea outside. And as they dig into it, they find the burial chamber. I'll read from her journal. Munro's face was dark. The inhabitants don't much like finding these burials. We were all breaths. A sharp clap of thunder at the moment completed the weird scene. Down in the darkness of the chamber shone something white. I was not the least afraid of the underground chamber, but I do dislike thunder and lightning. So I can recollect that I said, "Oh, let's go down to the house till this is over." The two workmen looked hopefully at me, and I'm certain that they would have gladly fallen in with my plan, but my husband, who is placidity itself, wouldn't hear of it. The story afterwards in the aisle is worth recording. An angel whispered to the lady that she was to open the mound. There was a clap of thunder. One workman was picked up 50 yards from the spot. The other fainted. The laird and lady turned pale. The detailed description of the discovery and the careful documentation, mapping and sketching show the skill and erudition of Eliza Burrows, as well as her enthusiasm. She describes this as one of the most interesting events of my life, a pursuit I can cordially recommend to anyone in search of excitement. But I think in this process of scientific discovery, there are also power dynamics at play. Reading this document as it reveals the mindset of the Trail Burrows, we see something there about the juxtaposition of their reason with the islanders' superstition, their belief in progress with the backwardness of those who don't much like encountering these kinds of mounds. We can see in that a certain idea of the improvement which changes the characteristic of mounds in the landscape from something otherworldly to something to be documented on archaeological, on purely human terms. But of course, approaching this against the grain, thinking about those who are present, those who are uneasy with what's happening, we can see this sense of disquiet messing with the unknowable, unkent landscape. Evidence of belief in the power of these locations that shouldn't be taken lightly, dovetailing with the rich folklore of burial mounds as otherworldly and potentially dangerous to those who don't give them sufficient respect. And given the context of the unpopularity of the Trail Burrows and their evictions, it can even be read in those terms: unease at outsiders interfering and damaging a place they don't understand. So what does all this have to do with our topic of Anthropocene magic? When we're talking about the Anthropocene, we're recognizing the acceleration of human geological agency to a point of global visibility in the Earth's strata, with long-term effects that can only be understood in relation to deep time, to geological time. Seizing control, directing ecosystems and geosystems to our will, in short, domesticating the whole Earth. The Anthropocene is an anthropocentric name for an anthropocentric epoch. Even that which humans leave unused in this epoch can only be rendered significant by the ecosystem services that it provides to us. Now, the infield outfield boundary is a kind of northern microcosmic model of that relationship between domesticated home space and a wider non-human universe which we move within. And the expansion of this infield to take out more and more of the outfield then is microcosmic of what we see happening on a global scale. Of course, important critiques have been levelled at the Anthropocene concept. Placing responsibility at the species level obscures unequal patterns of consumption. It draws attention away from the forms of dispossession that characterise the Anthropocene, most notably the violent effects of colonial attempts to force a landscape, as Heather Davis and Zoe Todd have argued. And Catherine Yusuf, in her book A Billion Black Anthropocenes, argues that our very ways of framing Earth history are entangled with the power dynamics of extractive colonialism. So when we're thinking about these logics of improvement, of the domestication of the land, we have to zoom out to see the wider story of exploitation of people and ecology that this entails. And that wider lens might help us to reconceptualize improvement, the making of apparent waste productive, rather than viewing it as the conquering of forces of the wild, bending them to our will. From a deep time perspective, this may well be an unleashing of powers beyond our control. The irony that attempts to master waste might bring about waste is beautifully expressed by Deborah Bird Rose in her account of Australian settler societies that she says are built on a dual war against nature and a war against the natives. Bird Rose, locating Australian ecocide within a global scene of extinction, inverts the settler perspective of the land as a wilderness to be subjugated by instead recognising that among the Indigenous Australians with whom she works, the true wild is that which is brought into being by the violence of attempting to transform the land. It's this forcing of the terrain that sets into motion unsustainable practices that result in ecological and human degradation. And these are practices whose ultimate outcome cannot be fully grasped or controlled. She says this is a landscape of loss, of topsoil, riverbanks, and ultimately of many of the species and habitats that supported Indigenous life. Country is becoming wild. Okay, so thinking about this in relation to magic, magic as a route to hidden knowledge, as with divination, or as a way of bringing forces under control, or as a means of supernaturally directing a particular effect in the world, we could say that magic is what gets squeezed out in the Anthropocene, as the world is fully harnessed for human, rational, economic utility. This is an epoch in which the whole planet is placed within our knowledge and grasp, engineered for efficacious ends. And for me, that's what's interesting about that episode of the account of the discovery of Taverso Tuic, of this sense of a progressive landowner who brings the land under control, leaving behind superstition, leaving behind the unknown and the otherworldly, of Lady Burroughs treating the cairn in its proper sense as an object of scientific investigation rather than a source of disquiet. And yet, reading that account against the grain in the reactions of those around them, even as those around them are cast as backward, I think we see a glimpse of the hubris of imagining a world that can be wholly subdued. To return to Deborah Bird Rose, in the course of conquering the wilderness, who knows what wild might be unleashed? Now, what piqued my interest in magic in the first place was a curiosity about the place that magic could occupy in a rationalized world. So, for example, what are we to make of modern standing stones on Rousey that seem to wink at the horizon of an occluded past? The work involved in quarrying and erecting stones like this means it's by no means a mild undertaking, but then again, it's not always one that can be taken too seriously. Modern stones might be said to be watching over us, helping us as they've always done, but on another occasion might be treated more flippantly and jokingly, a landmark to direct tourists to what was built as a holiday home. From a classic evolutionist perspective, magic is what is left behind on the path to modernity. We have no place for things like standing stones except as a joke. As the world becomes known, its forces placed under control. And it's interesting that from this perspective, folklore in Orkney often indexes its disappearance. So the Rousey tale of Jock an Ow in which a man becomes trapped in a mound after seeing the Trowies, these otherworldly mound dwellers, seeing them dancing within. That tale ends with a reflection that the Trowies all set sail for the neighbouring Isle of Westray, but their boat sank and they were all drowned. So magic is something that recedes from view. Max Weber, in a famous 1917 lecture to students at the University of Munich, Science as a Vocation, talks about this in the context of rationalization, as he describes how the world becomes knowable and calculable. He says that in such a world, there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play. One can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means. And yet we know very well that rationalization does not simply sweep magic away. And those who declare themselves to believe in nothing or declare it's all nonsense, frequently using stronger language, can nevertheless, in certain contexts, entertain the prospect of someone having healing hands and allow them to have a go on the grounds that there are things they don't ken, or discuss the viability of divination, or share stories of second sight, the precognition of death, as a characteristic of people in the past, or find themselves unsurprised when southerners who disturbed a mound found that their farm failed, or express disquiet about the possibility of ploughing certain land. And all of these seem unusual characteristics of unusual encounters within a disenchanted world. Yet Weber himself suggests that rationalization occupies an uncanny position in relation to knowability. And he drives the point home by contrasting the necessarily limited knowledge of the students that he's addressing in the audience with the holistic knowledge of the savage, as he terms him. He says, unless he is a physicist, one who rides the streetcar has no idea how the car happened to get into motion. The savage knows incomparably more about his tools. When we spend money today, how does it happen that one can buy something for money, sometimes more and sometimes less? The savage knows what he does to get his daily food and which institutions serve him in this pursuit. The increasing intellectualization and rationalization do not, therefore, indicate an increased general knowledge of the conditions under which one lives. What he's indicating is a gap that arises between the complexity of a knowable world and the tiny span of knowledge that each individual can possess within an increasingly specialized universe. And I think that's what we see in this entertaining of the possibility of magical knowledge even within grounds of disbelief. We see rationalization that leaves the world opaque. In the context of the Anthropocene, I'd say this space of unknowing takes on a particular significance. We see the expansion of our domesticated world under conditions of knowability that remain, from the vantage point of any individual, just out of reach, and in ways whose effects and impacts loom on the horizon, calling into question certainties of the present. Conversations I've had in Orkney that explore the connection between the elements and people's livelihoods show the ways in which rationalization itself opens up doubt. One conversation I had began by depicting magical thinking as something specifically of the past, as a remnant. He said, of course, folk were so much more dependent on the land and sea back then. If your survival depends on these, let's call them forces of nature, then that's out of your control. Folk before, they must have thought of them as some mysterious forces. They'd want some way of trying to get a handle on them. But then, interestingly, he pivoted to uncertainty. But how much do we know now, really? There's still so much. I sometimes wonder if we know as much as people used to, really. Or, in the words of another who made their living on boats, so much of this folklore was just having respect. And you might say we've lost the superstition, but I think we've lost with respect too. I'll conclude with this 2018 work by the Orkney artist Francis Scott. It takes its inspiration and name from the Orkney folklore of spring and autumn struggles, Vortolje and Gorvelje, the struggles between the sea mither, bringer of warmth and life, and her enemy Terran, the force of darkness and death. And these were struggles that would bring violent storms. Scott's statement for this piece explains, "I am drawn to the ubiquity of the sea in Orkney's folk history, and the ways in which our ancestors made sense of this entity, which can both sustain life and bring an end to it. I hope to convey a sense of consciousness, whether malignant or benign, bubbling away beneath the surfaces of the waters." Now, what's striking for me about this is the way that that statement and the art reflects our distance from such knowledge. It's folklore is knowledge of the ancestors, whilst allowing it to open up uncertainty about the future, granting it this uncanny presence, the potency of non-human forces on the horizon of our understanding. And I think this reminds us that to speak of Anthropocene magic may be a contradiction. The Anthropocene is precisely the rationalization, the domestication of the wild. But when we think of the Anthropocene in those terms, we realize that it's a contradiction in itself. Thank you so much for listening. And just before I finish, I'd like to give the references for 3 works that have been crucial to me as I've reflected on and learnt about this topic. The first is Dan Lee's paper, Northern World Views in Post-Medieval Orkney, a fantastic paper in which he sets out the relationship between infield and outfield as it plays out in Rousey. And it's that I've been reflecting on here, but I haven't really been able to do justice to it. But it's a fantastic paper. Joe Vergunst, or Joe Lee as he still was then, in his paper Experiencing Landscape, Orkney Hill Land and Farming, talks about these land use changes in great detail. And Deborah Bird Rose, in her book Reports from a Wild Country, Ethics for Decolonisation, really drove home to me the importance of inverting the idea of the wild as something we tame into the wild as something that we unleash through our attempts to force the terrain.